as well make a start then. When we're, when we're live. Feels almost awkward not starting with a couple of choruses, doesn't it? Sound. Okay, so most of you have probably seen the other two I've done on this, but for those who haven't and for those who are visiting, I've started doing this series, partly because I really like ancient history. It was just to kind of go through the empires that are in the prophecies of Daniel. So as you can see there, in Daniel chapter 2, the king sees a prophecy of, he has this dream where he sees this statue, and it's split into 4 or 5 separate materials, and each of those represent different empires. And the head of gold is identified as the king of Babylon at the time, and we follow through history, and we see what each of those empires represent in history. So just to put up a couple of aims, I've started all of them with this, but essentially the main aim of this is to really to open up a bit more of the story of the world outside of Israel, really, because the Bible often feels like it zooms in on just what Israel's doing, which is good. The Lord is active there. But it's when you start to see what's happening in the world around that it starts to really open up. And as well as that, you get a lot of people who say that the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales as well. But when you start looking at the history outside Israel and how it links in with what Israel's doing, it also, in my opinion, makes the Old Testament a lot more interesting and come alive, because you see the context of Israel within what the rest of the world's doing as well. And we also know that there is a prophecy in Daniel chapter 7 where he sees these 4 beasts coming out of the seas, and in the same way as the statue, these 4 beasts represent the empires. So we've seen the lion and the bear, which are the empire of Babylon, which was there when Daniel was, so him and the people were taken to Babylon, and then King Cyrus of Persia conquered the Babylonians. So now we're moving on to the next period of time, which is the Greek Empire. And just to put that into context with the Bible timeline as well, so we see the Babylonian period really covers all the way from Abraham, or before Abraham even, up to around this time where they go to Babylon. And then Persia conquers Babylon around here, this little sliver. And then after that, the Greeks conquer Persia around here, so we get another little sliver. And this is unique in being the only one which is actually between testaments, so it's hard to really tie it in with specific biblical events. But it really creates a bridge between the 2 testaments, and it ties in quite nicely with what Jamie's been talking about with the likes of the Maccabean revolt and Hanukkah. So as we saw in the Persia section as well, because the empires that had come before them had conquered the lands around, and they displaced a lot of the people, and people had begun to move around. The world was expanding. There'd been a massive movement of people, and this was around the time where the Jews began to move up into Europe, which is where we see a lot of other biblical prophecies and future events later on. But it also reaches a point where this becomes the first time where there are more Jews outside of Israel than there are within it as well. So there are lots of Jewish settlements in Turkey, in Greece, in Egypt as well. So just to give a bit of a background in onto Greece. I don't want to go too much into history of it, but what we often think is Greek mythology. A lot of these tales, they go back to several thousand years, potentially, before the time we're actually looking at. So you see stories like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where you've got like the Battle of Troy, the Trojan horse, and you've got Achilles with the arrow in the ankle there. Or should I say heel? That was stupid of me, Achilles' heel. And you get all these stories about like monsters and gods. And what you really start to see is the Greeks had this very sort of almost modern theatrical movie kind of aspect to their stories. Greece is very much the America and the Hollywood of the ancient world, I think. It was the spread of culture and writing that really makes them stand out from the other empires, because the other empires went and they conquered round. But Greece, they wrote down a lot more than the other empires, so we know a lot more of what they believed, and it's the ideas that really transcend just the places they conquered, really, and that's the mark that they leave on history. You also see they had this very strong vision of an ideal man, an ideal soldier. A lot of their myths and their stories are about, great muscly men conquering, monsters and things like Hercules. And when you look at the Greek soldier as well, they're often depicted as these very muscly and strong guys, like these two. And you can see there's no difference between them at all. But beside the joke, so that was an antique shop in Bury where I found that helmet. So that was just after I did the Persian one, actually, and I found that and I had to try it on because it was a proper Spartan helmet. It was £95, so I did not buy it. So yeah, I'm sure most of you know very well where Greece is in the world, so I'm not going to do a geography lesson or anything. But I mentioned in the presentation on Babylon, there was an event called the Bronze Age collapse. So this was before about 1000 BC, 1200 BC, around the time of the Book of Judges, where there were lots of thriving civilizations, and then suddenly a load of them fell apart. And this was around the time where you have the King Solomon, and you had the Golden Age of Israel. So there was an original civilization of the Greeks called the Mycenaeans, and they were the original sort of European civilization, and that's where you get a lot of these old stories, like the Trojan Wars. And after the Bronze Age collapse, like a lot of the other civilizations, they kind of fell apart and they began to grow up again in the next sort of 500 years. And Greece was this sort of collection of different city-states. So each one had their own king and their own leadership, their own like systems of law and government and everything. So we see a lot of well-known cities around there, the likes of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. These were a lot of the big players. But as the world sort of expanded, and really when you start to see the likes of the Persian Empire, because people had been displaced, they saw a lot more of the world. And so the Mediterranean became a much bigger center and hub of trade. So where Babylon was situated was no longer like the place to be. The Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea became much more opportunistic for the growth of the future, I suppose. So Greece was really well situated for all the trade and all the culture. So that's why it began to grow so much. Just to say as well, so this is something well known from today's world, the Olympic Games. And I'm sure many of us know that this was a Greek invention. So they first did this in 776 BC. And a big part of why they did this, well, there were three, I suppose, main reasons. One was to unify the different city-states, which is very similar to what we see today. Countries come together and they put on these big sporting events to unify the nations. Another one was to show off their soldier sort of skills, because a lot of early sports and things, they were more about like showing off their military prowess. So sports, things like running, throwing, combat sports, chariot racing, they were a lot of the early ones. It was about showing off to the states around them. And then of course it's the entertainment as well. People just enjoy sports. But this sort of fits in as well with the mythology and the idea of the perfect sort of muscly, strong man. Because one thing that Jamie mentioned when he was talking about the Greeks in Israel was that they installed gymnasiums. This was a big Greek thing. It's something that I found is completely opposite to the likes of the Romans. The Greeks, they built these gymnasiums specifically for people to get to train and to get strong and to almost show off how good they looked. And it's almost very superficial entertainment and very American way of looking at it, I suppose. Whereas the Romans, they were the opposite. They worked on the land, they worked on farms, so they gained their strength by, normal people just working hard labor jobs. But the main thing that the Greeks really, the main sort of Greek culture that comes out that we still look back to today is their philosophy. So they had this school in a place called Miletus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And this is where we really start to see the beginning of what we today might call Western society, which is about how we think and the way we imagine things like science and philosophy and literature and things. And this is just an example of a lot of the philosophers back in the day. And there are a lot of very interesting characters when you actually look through some of these. So the earliest example of a philosopher there, which is Thales. He was another guy who was very big and very muscly. His sort of claim to fame was that he went and predicted an eclipse to people. And at the time, this was a big deal because they all believed that it was the gods. So if you could go up to a bunch of farmers and tell them that this big, event was going to happen, and it turned out that it did, then they would probably see you as a god, because you had this superior knowledge. And you see other of these, like there was a guy, Xenophanes, who you might think of as the first atheist. So he really thought about a world where the gods didn't, they weren't in charge of everything or anything at all. And he was the first person to really imagine that the universe just existed and all these things happened. There was a guy called Parmenides who really comes across as this sort of typical old guy who's like, you kids, get off my lawn. He seemed quite crazy and depressed for most of his life. He convinced himself basically that because things can't come from nothing, that must mean that nothing exists and that everything is actually nothing, which is an extremely depressing way to live. And there was the likes of Pythagoras, who he was a big mathematician, but he was also a big cult leader. And apparently he was possibly afraid of beans as well. So some people think he died because some people were chasing him and he didn't want to run through a field of beans. He wanted to go around, so it's like, better to be killed than to run through beans. There was another guy who invented the idea of the 4 elements. Wind, fire, earth, and water. That was an old Greek idea. There was the likes of Democritus, who imagined the idea of what was discovered like 1,000 years later as the atom. So he was imagining splitting things apart, and if you could ever get to the point where you couldn't split it anymore. And of course there was people like Socrates. Socrates really changed the game on this, and he was famous and very disliked for. He never wrote anything down, but he was well known for basically walking up to random people and asking them big questions about life and existence. And it did slightly make me think of preaching the gospel in a way. But yeah, it just goes to show the amount that the Greeks really considered the universe, I suppose, in a way that no one ever had before, because people just worked and they got on with life, and the Greeks really, they sat down and they considered things, and a lot of the ideas, even if they're not, spiritual or biblical, it was an interesting shift in the way society worked. And as we see later on, it was because of things like this that we actually, the gospel was able to spread a lot through the Greek world as well. Just going into some scripture. So in Acts chapter 17, when Paul goes to Ephesus, we see this example here where it mentions by name that he went to see philosophers of the Epicurean and the Stoic branches. So this was 2 of the main branches of Greek philosophy, really. The Stoics were the kind of people who were very emotionless, and they taught very sort of quiet, controlled thought. Quite similar to Buddhism in a way, whereas the Epicureans were very much about do what you feel. So it's just interesting how this kind of fits in with the Bible as well, and it proves how much the New Testament and preaching the gospel was actually based around real people and real events as well. And the other big invention that the Greeks came up with was democracy. This was a bit of an experiment at the time. It was only fully taken on by the Romans. But this idea of people governing themselves rather than being under a king. So around the first millennium BC, there are a few places like Rome and Greece where a lot of kings were taking too much power for themselves. And the Greeks, as later the Romans did as well, they deposed the king, and they built this idea of the Senate. And as I'm assuming Jamie will go into a bit as well, during the time between the Testaments, when the Jews no longer had a king, they had to come up with other ways to rule themselves, and that's where we see the influence of the likes of the Sanhedrin, a group of leaders running the country and running the religion. So just taking that back to Bible prophecy again. When I read this particular scripture and this prophecy in Daniel 11, I was actually astounded because I'd never actually picked up on this properly, because I'd looked at the ones in Daniel 7. And when I was doing the Persian presentation, I mentioned about King Xerxes and how he wasted a lot of the Persian wealth trying to attack Greece, and how that eventually led to Persia's downfall and then being conquered by the Grecians. But if you look at this this prophecy that's in Daniel 11, so verse 2, it says there'll be 3 kings in Persia, and then the 4th will be far richer, and he will stir up the realm of Greece. Xerxes was the 4th king of Persia, and he was the richest, and he spent so much money trying to attack Greece, which is why Greece ended up trying to unify themselves. So it was a very big event on both sides, the Persians and the Greeks, because the Persians, it led to their downfall, but the Greeks, it led to them rising up and realizing that they are a power that could match the sort of superpower of the world. It took a bit of a while for them to do so, though, because the Battle of Thermopylae was in 480 BC. And after that, the Athenians, because they led the charge, they decided that they were now legitimately the ones who should rule Greece. But they had a couple of wars with the Spartans, particularly. So it wasn't for another 150 or so years that you get Philip of Macedon unifying all of Greece, and then Alexander the Great rose up to then lead the Greek army and actually conquer the Persians. That doesn't really come across in this prophecy because it makes it look like it's a connected event, but when you actually look at history, verse 2 seems to be about really around the time of the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, and then when you look at the rest of it, verse 3 and 4, it's clearly the king Alexander the Great then rising up, leading his army and then conquer the Persians. So what we see in Daniel 7, it's got this prophecy where it mentions the third beast being like a leopard, and it's got 4 heads. So there are 2 things I particularly want to pull out of this, because firstly, the fact that it's a leopard, so it made me think of a cheetah, because a cheetah is the fastest land animal, I believe. It can run about 70 miles an hour, but it can only run that that speed for about 15 to 20 seconds or so, because if it keeps going at that speed, its own body will, it's expended so much that it will basically die. So it's just like Alexander the Great. He was a person who he rose up very suddenly, and he was really powerful, and he spread his armies across a great portion of the world at the time, and he conquered so much. He's famous for being one of the only generals who won so many battles and never lost one. But he died about, I forget whether it's the age of 32 or 33, which is a ridiculous amount that he actually did in that age. And ironically as well, he died in Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's throne room, which of course Daniel was very familiar with, because he would have had this prophecy in Babylon at the time. So just going to show as well, so here's a map. I need to actually go forward here as well. So this was the map of all the places Alexander the Great conquered. And you see all the stars, they are all cities that Alexander the Great personally went to and personally named after himself. So the most famous one by far is Alexandria in Egypt, but all the way as far as Afghanistan and the edge of India as well. He basically personally went there with his armies and, claimed all the land for himself. I think Alexander himself basically believed himself to be a god as well. But the other aspect, so if you look at this map, so heads in Bible prophecy are often relating to points of authority. So Alexander was known for having 4 main generals, which you can see by the key code at the bottom. And as soon as Alexander died, the Greek Empire was no longer unified anymore. So it wasn't like the Persian Empire where it was one complete nation in a sense. As soon as he died, the whole thing split into 4 different groups, and each one was sort of ruled and named after his generals. So particularly what we focus on when we look at the history of Jerusalem is the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, because if you notice by here where it's got the little dot saying Tyre, that's modern day Lebanon, so that was around where Israel was, and these 2 branches of the Greek Empire fought over Israel quite a bit. The other thing we really see is that, because I mentioned with the Persians about how, actually I'll move on a bit. I mentioned with the Persians how it was just kind of a change in management really, because the Persians never actually conquered Israel as such. They didn't march in and attack them. It was just kind of, they defeated Babylon and therefore they became the ruling power. And for Israel, this was a similar sort of thing. Alexander's armies swept across the land and they conquered the land of the Persia. But it was the effect of how they managed their empire that was very different. The Babylonians had this idea that because they were the most powerful gods, or they had the most powerful gods, they just wanted to come in and rule everything. And they just wanted power, really. The Persians were different because they wanted to be managers of a massive system. So when you get the likes of the Cyrus cylinder, that was about how to rule a big country or almost company. The Greeks were a bit different. They believed in the difference between civilized and uncivilized. They believed that they were civilized and everyone else was uncivilized. So they had to go in and they had to convince everyone else to do things their way. So they were very hands-on managers, which is why when they take over Israel, they start to build a lot of things in there. The likes of temples and gymnasiums, and I think they might have built some colleges or universities there as well. The Jews quite liked the Persians because they mostly just left them alone and allowed them to follow their own religion, whereas the Greeks were really invasive. However, the Greeks did also believe in the concept of universalism. So even though they had their set of gods from old tradition, they also believed that everyone essentially followed the same gods, but it was just in different ways. They actually quite liked the Jews as well because Aristotle, for instance, had come up with the idea of the immortal soul. And when they realized the Jews believed in the same thing, they actually, were validated by that and believed that they essentially had the same philosophy, but a much more primitive version of it, I suppose. So they had to come in and teach the Jews how to think properly. So that's when you get this idea of sort of Hellenistic Judaism, which is really the period that Jamie's talking about. So I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but this is just a timeline of what happens with Israel under the Greeks. And this is very much a case study of the way they treated the nations that were under their management, really. So Alexander conquered them in 332 BC. And then they brought in all the Greek culture. And because there were a lot more Jews outside of Israel than there were inside now, the Jews had to spread the Jewish message out to people who didn't, who weren't under Israel anymore as well. So that's how they sort of piggyback on to Greek culture and translating the Bible into Greek, because it was the natural language of the day. It was the natural language of trade. And then the more Greeks sort of took over, the more they were invasive. That's when the Jews began to get a bit more unsettled. I heard it said as well, so in 198 BC, I put that this was when the the rule of Jerusalem switched to the Seleucids rather than the Ptolemaic. So the Ptolemaic was where Egypt was the center, and the Seleucids were like the old Persians. So the Jews liked the Persians more. And I've heard it said that because they fought over Jerusalem, depending on who was ruling Jerusalem at the time, depended on how they celebrated the Passover. Because when the Seleucids ruled them, they were a lot more focused on how Egypt was the villain of the story. And then the Ptolemaics did the opposite. So after that is when you start to get the build-up to the Jews becoming very unhappy and unsatisfied, and you get the likes of Antiochus IV becoming the guy who was in charge of Jerusalem, sent by the Greeks, and he changed the priesthood, as Jamie has talked about, and that led to the Maccabean revolt, and them introducing the festival of Hanukkah. And then after that, you begin to see the Jews wanting their own independent nation. And then that leads into the Hasmonean dynasty, which rules up until the time of until the time that the Romans established King Herod and his dynasty. It's sort of hard to say exactly where the Greek era ends, because on one side, Greece itself was conquered by the Romans around 168 BC, which is what I've got on the first slide. But the Greek rule continued through their other divisions, so the likes of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they very much carried Greek traditions and culture through them. But it wasn't until 63 BC, I've put there, where the Romans actually took Jerusalem. So on one side you see Athens was conquered by Rome in 168, but then it wasn't for another 100 years till Jerusalem itself changed to the Roman Empire as well. Just to end it now, I hope I haven't waffled on too long. I know it's always hard on a Sunday evening when someone's talking about ancient world history and you all want to go home and chill. But this is just a last picture I wanted to show, because so this is the churches by 100 AD. This is a lot of the effect of Paul's ministry, and you see a lot of the places that he mentions in the book of Acts and the letters of the churches themselves. So you've got the likes of Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth in Greece, the likes of Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia in Turkey. And then you've got the 7 churches of Revelation also in Turkey. There are other places mentioned in Acts like Antioch, Iconium, Tarsus. And what you notice is a lot of them are basically the Greek world. So apart from the odd church in the likes of Rome, maybe Alexandria, the vast majority is basically the gospel going out to the Greeks. So in the book of Romans, where it talks about the Jew and the Greek, on one side it's about the difference between the Jews and the Gentiles, but on the other side, because of Greek civilization and the Greek influence and trade and everything, they basically helped to engineer the gospel being able to go out, because they had such free thought that ideas like that could be spread out freely and openly, and people could travel around and they could share it in a language which was common to the people. This wasn't really a thing that could be done before, because everyone had a much more restrictive different cultures and different languages, so that you couldn't really push out new ideas into the to people in the same way. So even though the Greek Empire ended a lot earlier, I just thought it was fascinating to see how the Greek nation and what they believed in actually shows through in the New Testament, and actually really provides this vehicle for the gospel to go out. So yeah, I'll end it there. And yeah, the next one will be what happened with when the Romans took over, leading up to the end of the Second Temple. You can all go home now and have a nice rest. If we could close with some prayer. Granville, would you like to close the meeting, please?
Situations of the world, O Lord. And we give thanks for all things, especially our salvation, Almighty God, Lord. And ask that you just have your hand of blessing upon all the redeemed, O Father God, Lord, as we rejoice in